asceticism or monasticism. So in the last lecture, we looked at Augustine and Pelagius and talked about their views on the human person and sin and the nature of sin. And as a part of that lecture, I talked about how Pelagius was a monk. And so it's important to kind of think about how the monastic life begins to develop in the church. And to begin with, it's important to understand the ascetic life. What is the purpose of asceticism? Um, Asceticism is an emphasis upon the participation in suffering. And so as we think about the Christian faith, what we believe is that God became human in Jesus Christ and suffered and died on the cross. And you can also see that he went out into the desert and was tempted. And so that in many ways throughout his life, God enters into the suffering of humanity. Asceticism takes that notion of participating in the suffering of God in Jesus Christ very seriously. So in the book of Philippians, Paul's letter to the Philippians, we read this passage where it talks about how in Jesus Christ, God empties God's self. And this is referred to as the kenotic self-emptying of God. God empties God's self and suffers in the person of Jesus Christ, and then Christ is exalted and ascends to sit at the right hand of the Father. So this becomes a model for the Christian life, this notion of self-emptying and participating in suffering. We also see very early on when Christianity is at odds with the empire, how martyrdom becomes very important, that suffering for the sake of the gospel, being persecuted and dying because you're a Christian, it plays a very important role in the first couple centuries of Christianity, to the point that they would even say that to do so, to suffer and die for the sake of the gospel, is to become a word of God, a sign of God's kingdom in the world. Now, one person where we see this is Ignatius of Antioch. So I have this picture of Ignatius up here. He actually died by being eaten by lions. And we have some writings where he talks about this idea of suffering. So here's what he writes. He says, I'm being ground by the teeth of the beast so that I may appear as pure bread. Again, connecting his own suffering and death with the kind of Eucharistic suffering of Christ. Rather, coax the beast that they may become my tomb and leave no part of my body behind, that I may not be a nuisance to anyone when I have fallen asleep. Then shall I be truly a disciple of Jesus Christ, when the world shall not even see my body. Entreat the Lord for me, that through these instruments I may appear as a sacrifice to God. I do not lay injunctions on you as Peter and Paul did. They were apostles. I am a convict. They were free. I am a slave, up till now. But if I suffer, then I am a freed man of Jesus Christ and shall rise free in him. Now I am learning in my bonds to abandon all desire. What we begin to see here in Ignatius of Antioch is this idea that suffering itself and martyrdom it becomes a form of spirituality where a person becomes more free through their suffering and through their death. He also writes this, from Syria to Rome, I'm fighting with wild beasts, by land and sea, by night and by day, being bound among 10 leopards, I mean the squad of soldiers, who become worse in return for their gratuities. But through the wrongs they do me, I become more of a disciple. Yet I'm not justified on this account. I hope I may have profit of wild beasts, that they have been got ready for me, and I pray that they may prove expeditious with me. I will coax them to eat me up expeditiously, and not refuse to touch me through cowardice, as they have done in some cases. Why, if they refuse, though I am willing, I will force them to it. I ask your indulgence. I know what is for my good. Now I am beginning to be a disciple. May nothing of all things visible and invisible grudge my attaining to Jesus Christ. Let all come, fire and cross and conflicts with beasts, hacking, cutting, wrenching of bones, chopping of limbs, the crushing of my body, cruel chastisement of the devil laid upon me. Only let me attain to Jesus Christ. So here we have a very vivid picture of this kind of ascetic focus of martyrdom, that through the suffering, we participate in the suffering of God in Jesus Christ, and we become more Christ-like through that suffering. So we also see this in Cyprian. So here's a quote from Cyprian. Assuredly, God, who cares for all, gave to life a certain medicine, as it were, in martyrdom. When to some he assigned it on account of their deserving, to others he gave it on account of his mercy. Martyrdom is medicinal because it leads to the death that leads to life. In the baptism of water is received the remission of sins. In the baptism of blood, the crown of virtues. Here we see that martyrdom, very early on, almost took on this idea of granting immediate entrance into heaven, that it became a means by which Christians could express their faith, express their allegiance to Christ, and by doing so, kind of purify themselves as they moved into the next life. So all of this makes sense in a world in which the church is at odds with the empire. They're being persecuted for their faith and they're dying. But eventually, Christianity becomes the religion of the Roman Empire, and that persecution stops. So it leads to this question about how can we participate in the suffering of God when martyrdom is really no longer much of an option. And this is what leads many people to move out into the desert. And we get this group of people called the Desert Fathers and Mothers who leave civilization and they live out in the desert. Now, how do we make sense of this? Well, it's important to see how for them that spiritual discipline was an important part of their going out. It's not that they hated the body, and this is really important. They didn't hate the body, they didn't hate material creation. They believed that the flesh needed to be disciplined. They believed that their desires and their emotions needed to be disciplined. And so again, I return to the picture of the charioteer with the horses. And this is grounded, last time we saw this was with Plato. So this is grounded in kind of Greek philosophy with Plato and Aristotle. And this idea that the spiritual needs to take charge of the material. Now, we are living at a time when this idea of discipline is in many ways non-existent. The only place where we still find it is probably in athletics, where people are willing to put themselves through grueling practices and training to play basketball or softball or volleyball or whatever it is that people are playing. But when it comes to our spiritual life, more and more we don't see things the same way. But this is how the Desert Fathers and Mothers really began to see it. And so rather than martyrdom, moving out into the desert and living in the desert to do battle with the demonic and Satan and to discipline oneself becomes the new way of practicing spiritual formation. So what we have here is a picture of St. Anthony, and we'll read about that event here in a minute. But what I want to do is frame the Desert Fathers and Mothers in a more positive light. I think it's hard for us to understand what it is that they're doing because we just don't think this way anymore. And we're so socially connected today that we can't imagine going out and living on our own and giving up everything and living in the desert. What we see here is a belief that the broader cultural forces can push us in the wrong direction. I mean, one of the questions that the church deals with when it comes to sin is sin inherent within us, or is sin part of our environment? And what we see with the early Desert Fathers and Mothers is this sense that the broader culture itself was in many ways sinful and was shaping people in the wrong way. And so they refuse to participate in the established order. They move out into the desert and they call for renunciation and detachment. And the whole focus of this is on renewal. It's too easy for us to think that, oh, the Desert Fathers and Mothers hated humanity or they hated creation. No, they didn't. They were opting out of a particular way in which the world was being formed and shaped. And in this opting out, they are actually calling for the renewal of the world. So I'm going to ask you to watch a video with Father Lazarus. And it's interesting how Father Lazarus would argue that he is out in the desert praying for the world, interceding for the world. And so it's important to recognize what it is that the Desert Fathers and Mothers believed that they were doing. It's also important to, again, see that notion of word. It's as if they're enacting. They become a symbol or a sign of the kingdom of God, that their very life becomes a word of God, and that this is what it means to live this monastic life. We also see something that is called the eschatology of the desert life, that they believe they're living in the last days, but more than that, they're fighting temptation. Just as Jesus went into the desert to fight Satan, they too are going out to be tempted and to fight that temptation and seek the end of the age, which again speaks to a renewal of the cultural world in which people lived. And so the focus is on renewal, it is on reformation, but it's also important to see how they're engaging the demonic. And it's easy for us to think about them believing in personified demons and angels, which I think it's fair to say that they did. And again, the painting of St. Anthony demonstrates this idea that there's a demonic at work in the world. But it's also important to read this in terms of this internal struggle. That the demonic, so often we possibly think about it in terms of those creatures out there somewhere. But maybe also what the demonic is getting at is this wrestling with our own self, that we have these desires and these thoughts and so on that we need to tame, and that becomes an important part of thinking about the demonic. And I'm not sure that this is clear for us because we don't necessarily live this way anymore, but for them it was a life of freedom and living without fear. that letting go of all of those things that bind us, not being concerned about economic status, political status, cultural status, but stepping outside of these things, finding our identity someplace else, and living into our humanity that is marked by the person of Jesus Christ. This is what they are arguing. This is what they believed that they were doing as they went out into the desert. So one of the first persons that goes out that we know of is St. Paul of Thebes. But probably the most well-known person that went to live in the desert very early on is St. Anthony of Egypt. He was wealthy. His parents died. He sent his sister to live in a convent. He gave them some money to care for her and then gave the rest to the poor. And then he went out into the desert. He had heard the words where Jesus says to the rich young ruler, give up everything you have to the poor. And so he takes that seriously, and he does that. He goes out into the desert to live a life of renunciation, solitude, work. It's important to recognize how work is an important part of the monastic life, and prayer. So while he is out there, he has this encounter with the demonic. And so again, we can see the struggle that he's engaged in. So this comes from the life of St. Anthony that was written by Athanasius. Here's what he writes. The demons made such a racket that the whole place was shaken, knocking over the four walls of the tomb. They came in droves, taking the form of all kinds of monstrous beasts and hideous reptiles. The whole place was filled with lions and bears and leopards, bulls, wolves, asps, scorpions. The lions roared, ready to attack. Bulls seemed to threaten him with their horns. Snakes advanced, crawling on the ground, seeking a place of attack, and wolves prowled around him. They all were making a terrible noise. Groaning in pain, St. Anthony faced the demons, laughing. If you had any power, only one of you would be enough to kill me, but the Lord has taken away your strength, so you want to frighten me by your number. The proof of your powerlessness is that you're reduced to taking the form of senseless animals. If you have any power against me, come attack me. But if you cannot do anything, why torment yourselves unnecessarily? My faith in God is my defense against you. But all of a sudden, a bright light illuminated the tomb. At that moment, the demons vanished. The pains ceased. When he realized that God was coming to his aid, he asked, "Where were you, Lord? Why did you not stop this suffering earlier?" God answered him, "Anthony, I was present at your side, but I waited observing your fight. And since you have resisted so bravely, I will now always be at your side. I will make your name famous throughout the world." Having heard the words of the Lord, the monk stood up and prayed. He then received such strength that he felt in his body an even greater vigor than before. So Anthony goes out and he actually entombs himself in this cave that was an old tomb. And this is where he has this experience of these demons attacking him. And you see here that as he moves through it, he becomes freed from fear. That God tells him at the end that you withstood the temptation and now you are freed from fear. And so he goes out into the desert and he lives, and his life becomes a sign and symbol of, in some sense, true humanity. What it means to live in relationship with God, a true spirituality. And again, I want to emphasize this is not in opposition to the body. Anthony works. They go out and they do work. So it's not like they're just sitting around all day, but work is a part of what it means to be human. And so we see within the Desert Fathers and Mothers this kind of reclaiming of the human vocation out in the middle of the desert. Another important person who begins monastic communities is Saint Benedict, and this happens in Italy. Born in 480, he lived a hermetic life where he went off by himself and lived by himself, but eventually he becomes the leader of a community. And so we actually have two different kind of groups of monks or ascetics that begin to develop. You have those who go off and live by themselves in caves or wherever in the desert, in the mountains, and then you have those who start communities and other people come around them and they live with them. And so Benedict starts as someone who goes off to live by himself, but then he's invited to come and kind of be the leader of a community. And so he begins this rule, the rule of St. Benedict. And it establishes rules for living together. How do we live this ascetic life, this monastic life together? And the focus of the rule of St. Benedict is on prayer, it is on study, it is on work, and it is on living together in community. And so Benedict becomes one of the more well-known rules of the monastic community. And so it's important to recognize the different types of monasticism that develops. The Hermetic, which the hermits, they separate themselves, and this is where we get the Desert Fathers and Mothers. But the Cenobite then becomes a form of monasticism in which they live together in community, and they establish different rules. And so you see there are different rules. The rule of St. Pachomus, one of the first ones, the rule of St. Augustine, the rule of St. Basil, and the rule of St. Benedict. And so all of these different communities have their rules, and many of them still exist today. You can have the Benedictines where you go and they're living together according to the rule of Saint Benedict. Now, I realize that for most of us as Christians, this is not the way we think about the Christian life. But this, very early on in Christianity, was an important part of the Christian life. It develops into monasticism that carries on to this very day. We'll see that in the medieval period, the monastic life becomes very, very important. We'll also see how in the Reformation, Luther and Calvin begin to push back against certain distortions of the monastic life. But as we'll see with Calvin, he wanted all Christian people to live like monks in the world. So he's not so much as rejecting this ascetic or monastic life as in saying this should be the way all Christians live. So this has been, thus far, we've been kind of looking at the development of Christianity as it moves in some of its earliest periods. In some of the next lectures now, we'll kind of turn toward the medieval period, and we'll see the continued development of the church, some of the primary issues that we've already kind of been talking about with the Eucharist and the sacraments. We'll see a split that is going to happen, and then we'll see the rise of certain theologians like Thomas Aquinas. We'll talk about Julian of Norwich and others that are kind of symbols of this medieval period.